Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webcast. My name is Ross Mitchell, and I'm a risk consultant here at Presidium. Today, we're going to be talking about getting back to the basics of abuse prevention in your youth ministry. I want to thank Insurance Board for hosting this webcast today and broadcasting it out to all their members and partners. Just a quick note, even though this is being filmed ahead of time, I do want to let you know that we've got a chat box available for you where you can ask questions in real time as this presentation is being presented to you. I want to also note that we've got 4 questions that we're going to kick off today's presentation with to get you thinking about what your practices are at your church and how perhaps you can improve them with the information we talk about today. So our first question is, are your boundary expectations formalized in church policy and communicated to parents and youth? Think about that. There's no right or wrong answer currently. Just want you to think about what your practices are and share that with us. Second question, how do you manage outside contact and pre-existing social and familial relationships in your youth ministry? I know this can be a really challenging one for churches. I'm from a small town and I understand how intertwined church and youth group and friendships and family can be. But think about, how do you manage this? And let's talk about some strategies in this webcast and in the question section about how we can improve that. Third, do you train your staff and volunteers on the specifics and the why behind your boundary expectations? If not, this might be a really easy way to improve those practices. So think about your response to that. And again, we'll come back to that at the end of the presentation to sort of level set where everyone is. And then lastly, and in some ways, most importantly, do you think you or others in your church would feel empowered to report red flag behaviors or policy violations in a ministry that's occurring in your church? This is one of the most important areas that we at Presidium work with our clients on. So something to think about and be intentional about as you go through this presentation. So take a look at those, think about those, and we are ready to get started with this informative content. Thanks. So why are we talking about this today? What brings this concept to the forefront right now? The largest and the biggest catalyst for talking about this today is that most churches are back to operating fully on-site, or at least mostly on-site with maybe some hybrid options. So it's really an exciting time in the life of our churches and of our participants to be back in church programming. It's important to note, though, that expectations and norms have shifted during COVID. In the last 18 months, things have gone from in-person to virtual, back to in-person. And in that, behaviors have changed, expectations have changed, and everyone's sort of just been getting through, at home or with their smaller group. And so as you come together with your larger group of participants in your ministry, we want to make sure we take time to level set and share what our expectations are, again, for everyone. This brings us an opportunity to examine what's worked and what hasn't. So thinking about what has worked and what changes were made during COVID that we want to keep. And then what things do we need to walk back and say, this was appropriate for COVID, but now that we're back to on-site programming, we're going to walk this back to what our expectation was before. We're going to talk about all of these things and more in the rest of the presentation today. So thank you for staying tuned. We look forward to answering your questions on these topics. Before we can dive into the rest of the content, it's important to understand how adult offenders operate. Adult offenders in organizations follow some typical patterns, and they all need some level of the concepts of access, privacy, and control in order to offend against youth. So as we go forth in setting our policies and our boundaries and expectations in our programming post-COVID, it's important to figure out how we can limit access, privacy, and control to would-be offenders while still maintaining the same quality of programming that we want to have as part of our ministry. When we think about access means physical or electronic proximity, that access to the youth in order to begin the grooming process. But it also means having access in a way that's not unusual. So by virtue of your programming, you have access, or offenders potentially have access to your youth. When we think about limiting that, there are some strategies we'll talk about later, but know that that's an important first step and boundary that you can put up to prevent abuse in your programs. Next is privacy. So once an offender has access, they need some level of privacy and able to groom the youth that they are seeking to groom. That can look like physical privacy, so one-on-one spaces, remote spaces, rides home, etc. But it can also look like electronic privacy, where we're communicating electronically via social media, emails, texting, etc. So as we go forward, thinking about what does your church do, or what do you have in place to limit privacy of would-be offenders? Control is the last thing that offenders need, and it relies on that access and privacy to get to the control space. When we think about control, we think about this in three distinct areas. Offenders will physically control or attempt to physically control youth by testing physical boundaries. Here, it's important to limit and think about what do our policies say about physical interactions with youth, as this is a way to eliminate or minimize that risk of an offender gaining control in that way. The second is verbal discussion. So offenders need to verbally manipulate their youth by talking about things that conjure up emotions of fear, shame, guilt, etc. One of the things that churches and other organizations can do to limit this control, this verbal control, is to put some procedures in place and policies in place around what discussions can be had with youth and what discussions perhaps need to be shared with others, so that this isn't a situation where the youth and or staff are getting enmeshed. Lastly, we look at community grooming as a function of control, meaning that the offender will groom the community to think that they are central to the mission and operation of the organization, so that if somebody brings a complaint forward, they won't be believed, it will be difficult to investigate, etc. Your church can do a lot to dispel this by sharing with parents and youth and everyone else that no one is above reproach and that the rules apply to everyone, and that the reporting processes will be followed regardless of who a report is made against. As we talked about in the previous section, offenders need access and privacy and control in order to offend. One of your best lines of defense against that are implementing policies and procedures that limit those three items. One of the things that you can do post-COVID is to review your child abuse prevention policies and determine whether or not there are updates that you need to do. One of the questions you may have is, do we even have these things written down? It would not be abnormal for a small church to not have these concepts in writing. But as we emerge from COVID, and now after this webinar, it becomes apparent that this is something we need to do. If you do have them, think about whether your current policies and procedures reflect the emerging needs of your church. How have your ministries changed during COVID? And how do you anticipate them continuing to change as we move toward a pre-COVID normal? One of the other things that you want to think about is whether or not your existing policies are clear and effective. If they're not, you want to make some changes to them that help fit the lived experience at your church and in your ministries. Because we know at Presidium that if policies aren't reflective of the lived experience, people won't do them. And there's no point to have a policy manual that isn't followed. To that end, specifically, you want to examine policy changes that were made during COVID-19 and consider whether or not they continue to fit the present needs of your ministry. As I mentioned earlier, many churches went to a virtual model where programming was happening virtually, and youth ministers were able to contact youth via electronic communications like Zoom and other things. And that just may not fit your needs anymore. Maybe it does, but it requires a contemplative discussion with stakeholders to understand whether or not this is necessary, and if so, how do we make this safe, not only for our youth, but for our staff as well. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, electronic communications are one of those areas that we saw expand greatly during COVID, but we're starting to see some of that contract in schools and churches and other groups that we work with. You specifically want to contemplate whether your ministry will continue to include a component of virtual programming or just more broadly electronic communication. If you do anticipate continuing to use that, you want to make sure that your electronic communications policies provide guidance to your staff and to your youth for those interactions. One of the best rules of thumb out there is to use electronic communication sparingly and strategically. So there may be some programmatic or ministerial reasons why you want to have electronic communications available to your staff and youth. But it's important to remember that we don't want this to be ubiquitous or to become the norm. We want to make sure that to the extent possible, we're limiting that access and privacy to would-be offenders by requiring communication to happen in appropriate channels. Could be church email, could be via the church youth groups page on Instagram or social media, something that has a little bit of oversight so that it's not just the youth minister or the staff and the youth communicating frequently electronically, because that puts you at a higher risk to develop some of those inappropriate verbal communications and discussions that can lead to an incident of abuse. You want to also think about your policies and making sure that you're clear on what one-on-one should look like. So maybe there's a reason, or you decide that you need to have the youth minister and should be able to communicate with the youth group via an app like Remind. That's okay, because it's a group communication, and so by virtue of that, the privacy aspect is less. However, we want to make sure that we have some clear guidance for staff on what those one-on-one interactions should look like, if and when they're acceptable, and what parameters and what sort of documentation or notice to someone else in the church should be if those are to occur. Similar to that point, you want to make sure that you're setting limits on when and how staff can communicate with youth virtually. If youth are back in programming in person, then there's less of a reason to engage electronically. However, if they're not, then perhaps a little bit more of a reason. All said, though, we want to get this under control and make sure that you understand how this operates, how this currently works in your ministry, and what should be done to make it better. One of the areas that we see churches and other organizations really struggle to grasp and understand and put parameters around is the concept of pre-existing social and familial relationships and outside contact. I myself am from a small town and was involved in a youth group as a kid, and our youth pastor was our neighbor, was also my parents' friend, and I was friends with his kids. And so I completely understand how this looks for many of you who are on the webcast today. But regardless of that, we want to make sure that we're setting realistic guidelines for staff and high access volunteers, if you have those, regarding contact outside your ministry. So what does this look like when you have all of these different relationships walking into the church? Are staff and high access volunteers allowed to spend time with youth outside of programming? Let's assume that perhaps the youth minister or other staff don't have a relationship with someone prior to their participation in church. This is a little easier to answer, because of course that would be no. However, if you have a pre-existing social or familial relationship outside of youth group, and now that person is now in your youth group, how do we manage that? Do we have parameters on that? It becomes a little easier if this person is related to you, but if this youth is just a family friend, something to think about empowering your staff with is they open themselves up to a false allegation the more outside contact they engage in with a youth. And so while it may be a family friend, perhaps you don't take that family friend one-on-one to McDonald's. Maybe you think about some other ways that you take them, you can see them in a group context perhaps or with other youth, but limiting really that one-on-one contact for your sake and of course most importantly for the youth's sake. As a church, it's important to think about how we set those limits and those expectations for our staff. Some churches will require a form, a pre-existing relationship form that sort of lets the church know that you have these relationships walking into your ministry. Some find that a little bit too much, but many settle on the idea that if there are more involved things happening between a youth group participant and a youth minister or other staff member, that some notice to a supervisor is helpful just to increase transparency, which decreases privacy. The other thing to think about with this is so many of these relationships and concepts around this are not really formalized or documented in any sort of written way. And so if you find that your church is in this space, you really want to think about getting stakeholders together, maybe talking with staff or folks involved in ministry who have youth in programming to understand what this looks like for them and how they think they could make this safer. So getting some benchmarking by relevant stakeholders is one of your easiest ways to put some parameters around this type of interaction. One of the other things your church can do in this post-COVID world is take a look at your youth code of conduct. And if you don't have one, create it. And if you do have one, update it and include concepts like electronic communication, one-on-one interactions with staff, outside contact, pre-existing social or familial relationships. Make sure that it has all of those important boundary concepts that we've described earlier. Make sure also that the code of conduct addresses appropriate online interactions, not just with staff, but with other youth in your programming. You may not be able to formally discipline on bullying incidents that happen in your youth group, but you want to put in your code of conduct that you'll have a conversation if these things come up and it affect negatively the youth group environment. So think about adding things that maybe you don't have, but for those of you who are creating this from scratch, know that the Insurance Board has partnered with us. We've got some resources that we can share with you on this topic. Most importantly, whether you're creating or updating, it's important to clearly define standards for staff, volunteers, and youth, and then share that with youth and parents. And so any of your youth protection policies or things that govern electronic communication, outside contact, one-on-one interactions, physical and verbal discussions, you want to make sure those are shared in the code of conduct or maybe a parent handbook so that you have that information available to parents and students. They can become another set of eyes and ears on this risk. And I'll let you know, I had a case once where a parent knew what the expectations of her student's school were when it came to electronic communication. She's found out that a teacher was violating those, let the school know, and the school investigated and uncovered an inappropriate relationship, and that person is now in jail. And so for those of you that may think, well, parents and students aren't really going to pay attention to this, that may be the case for some, but know that you're giving parents and youth the tools to be an extra set of eyes and ears on this risk when you provide them with that information. So make sure you create or update your youth code of conduct with all of the relevant things that would be helpful for detecting or responding to abuse, and share that with parents and youth so that they can be champions for this as well. You also want to make sure that you screen employees and volunteers or rescreen them and retrain them if they have been absent from your programming during COVID or for any stretch longer than 6 months. So for particularly if you have seasonal folks or high access volunteers, you want to rescreen them to assess whether anything has occurred in the time since they were actively working for you that may preclude them from your ministry or from employment in the church. If they've been out of programming for 6 months, as I mentioned, might want to background check them again. If you're not background checking employees and volunteers yet, you certainly want to start that practice. And then you want to redistribute your updated code of conduct to all returning employees. So hopefully, as a result of this webcast, you will update your code of conduct with these boundary concepts that we've discussed. And you'll want to share that information with your employees and volunteers as they are coming back online into this programming. You want to also retrain and level set expectations around youth safety. You want to think about or include topics such as abuse prevention, the concepts of access, privacy, and control, sort of that why piece of why do we have all of these new policies and procedures. And then you want to train specifically on what those changes are to your policies and procedures to ensure that everyone understands and is clear on the why behind this and the importance of these policy changes. I just want to share an anecdote of why screening and training is so important, particularly in churches. Years ago, Presidium worked with the FBI on monitoring a chat on the dark web of would-be offenders, and they were seeking access to a particular organization and were asked the original poster posed the question, I'm interested in offending and I'm looking at this particular organization. Is this a good idea, yes or no? And a lot of conversation came in. And at the end of the day, because of the organization's screening and training and policies surrounding abuse prevention, they opted not to perpetrate abuse in that organization. But more troublingly, or perhaps most troublingly, their response was, I'll just go be a youth pastor down at the church down the street because I know they don't check anything. And so I say that to share with you that sometimes there's a feeling out there that churches want to believe in the best in everyone and they want to take everyone at their word. And while that's a wonderful quality, it's important to remember that we have a duty to our youth and to our church and our community to do what's right and do industry standard when it comes to our youth programming. And so re-screening and retraining are key components of that. The risk of not doing that is particularly high in the church context because we've seen countless cases of people discussing losing their faith in the wake of an abuse incident. And so while the reputational harm for the church is great, the potential for spiritual harm is much more significant. And so it is really important to pay attention to this slide and to think about how you're screening and training employees and how you're arming them to become champions of abuse risk management in your church and your particular ministries. As I mentioned earlier, it's important to train our employees and volunteers on abuse risk management. And we want to be strategic about what training topics we include and what we share with them. Not every staff member or employee is going to get the same type of training. Those that work more closely with youth, of course, would get the full range of trainings, whereas those who aren't, you might give them the general why and talk about your policies, but not delve into specific procedures. In general, though, topics need to include abuse prevention policies and procedures. So those concepts that you've painstakingly put into writing, we want to share that with everyone so that they know what our expectations are at our church. And then we want to refresh training on response procedures. And one of the best ways to do that is via tabletop exercise, where you give your staff a scenario and let them talk about how they would respond to this particular incident were it to happen at your church. This can give you some real clues as to whether or not there are reporting barriers or responding barriers, whether or not there's a climate for reporting, and whether or not anybody really knows what your response procedures are. And so I would recommend heavily doing that in a staff meeting or volunteer orientation or whatever the case may be, wherever you've got everyone together, just pitching the question out to them of what would we do if this happened in our organization. Anyone that's in a supervisory capacity also needs that refresher training on how to respond as a supervisor. So what's their role in responding to abuse or to an allegation? And for many, this could be a tabletop exercise as well, because with those, you really get an idea or a sense of where your staff's minds are and what has been committed to memory, or what is their understanding, and versus what they have to look up in a policy manual. So think about those training opportunities in staff meetings or other locales where you get everyone together and kind of brainstorm what our response would be. You want to also think about identifying methods to make sure that your abuse prevention training isn't just once a year, that it's an ongoing thing. So maybe you do some Presidium Academy modules. Maybe you do other modules online via insurance or other partners. Regardless of the type of training, you want to do more than just one abuse prevention touch point a year. So those staff meeting discussions, tabletop exercises, newsletters, as you're starting to update your policy manual, maybe it's dropping an updated policy in for people to see as they come out. All of those things give you regular touch points, which help retain information that your staff and volunteers have learned in that initial onboarding training or that initial annual training. So think about what occasions do you already have to bring your staff and your volunteers together? How do you disseminate information and then infuse this abuse prevention concepts in that? One of the important things to think about as we're returning to on-site programming is supporting your staff and high access volunteers. You want to understand what's going on with them. There are a lot of changes and a lot of challenges in our current world, and it's important to listen to needs and offer resources where necessary or where needed. It's important to listen to needs from your staff and your high access volunteers because they're the ones out working in your ministry space with your participants. And so they need to be able to vocalize what they need, what's working, what's not, how the youth have potentially changed during COVID, etc. And so you want to be responsive to and provide a space for them to share those ideas, questions, concerns, concepts that come up, etc. You want to also then, once you understand what this lived experience looks like for them and how things have changed since 18 months ago when we were all on site pre-COVID, you want to advocate for those changes and for the needs that your employees and your youth are bringing forward, if indeed they are. That could be maybe some pushback to a policy that you've changed, and we want to be responsive to that. It could be that the policy doesn't fit the lived experience, and so we want to pay attention to that and figure out a strategy to make it fit that lived experience. Specifically for employees and for youth, this has been an emotional roller coaster for all of us. And so we want to allow employees and youth a space to vent in a safe and healthy way, and also understand when staff or youth or volunteers venting is getting to a place where it's not something that you can handle or manage yourself, and you may need to pass that on to someone else. It could be the content of what's being brought up is beyond what you're prepared to manage. It could be that the frequency is something that you don't have time or space to manage. And so you want to be responsive and share that with your supervisor so you can think about some ways to get these folks that space to bring needs and complaints forward, but not burn yourself out as well. One of the things that we know at Presidium is that burnout increases the chances of an abuse incident because staff who are burnt out don't pay attention to the small patterns of behavior, the grooming behaviors that we would call red flag behaviors. And so we want to ensure that our staff and volunteers and that our youth aren't burnt out so that they can remain vigilant against this risk. And lastly, we want to offer encouragement and empathy. This has been a trying time for everyone. everyone's mental health in some way, shape, or form has been affected by this. And in many ways, or in many cases, physical health as well. And so we want to be responsive and empathetic to the staff and youth and the volunteers that we're serving. So make sure that we build in a space for that in your programs, whether it's before programming, after, perhaps there are certain routine checkpoints that supervisors have with staff and volunteers. But make sure that we're supporting our staff, because staff who feel supported and who are adequately prepared to manage their programs are in a better place to help identify red flag behaviors, identify would-be offenders, and ultimately prevent abuse in their ministry. One of the most important takeaways from this webcast is this concept of the rule of three. In all areas of your church and in all activities, you want your staff and youth to utilize the rule of three. This means no one-on-one interactions between staff and youth, and no one-on-one interactions between youth themselves. This manifests in some different ways. So sometimes it is 2 youth and 1 adult, or 2 adults and 1 youth. It depends on the program and what makes sense for them at that time. But regardless, this rule of three is one of your best lines of defense in keeping your youth safe and also preventing false allegations against yourself. It's going to depend on a variety of factors as to whether or not this is feasible. Sometimes, in a ministry context especially, youth want to talk to their youth minister about something that's going on and they don't want everyone else to hear that. If that happens, think about some ways that in some places that you can go that provide oversight or transparency in that interaction, but still allow you to have that discussion with your youth. That could be in my church, for example, as a kid, all of the youth met in the basement. And so a conversation like this could have happened in the sanctuary, which is out in the open for everyone to see, but nobody was in there when everybody was in the basement in our worship time. And so think about some places you can have these conversations that are not behind a closed door in a closed office, etc., to increase that transparency, to limit the potential for any sort of grooming behaviors, for control, for privacy, but also to limit your risk of false allegations in that discussion. Naturally, these are hard to define, and you can't define every conceivable thing, but a lot of it is just empowering your staff to know that the rule of three is there to protect everyone. And so that is our default rule. That's what we would expect and want of everyone. And these one-off situations where a youth member wants to talk about something away from everyone else should be the outlier and not the norm. But even in those discussions, you as church leadership may want to get together and think about where those interactions should and could happen, were they to happen at your church. Another thing that we want to talk about today are what we call high-risk situations. At Presidium, the following things that we're going to talk about are where we see the increased risk of abuse, whether that is adult to youth or youth to youth. So you want to think about creating supervision plans with best practices and procedures for the following high-risk situations. Things like bathrooms. How do we send our youth to use the restroom? Do they go one-on-one? Do they have to check in with anyone? Can they just go as they please? What is our expectation there? Do we have an expectation? And what's realistic to put in place for this particular risk? Bathrooms present one of the higher risks for youth to youth sexualized behaviors, due in large part to the privacy afforded to them. Of course, no adults want to be in there. And so youth may sneak off into that area. So we want to think about how do we manage that. Similarly with transportation. I don't know if transportation is something that's back in the lineup for your programs, but I remember going on church trips in one of the big 16-passenger vans and people getting up to no good in the back seat. And so it's important to think about, how do we supervise that? We know that we're traveling with teenagers, or potentially younger youth, but how do we manage that? How do we maybe put another parent chaperone or staff member or someone else back there to make sure that all of those behaviors during our transportation are appropriate and are fitting with the mission and the objectives of our program? One of the things we see as well is free time. Free time is a challenging time because it's difficult to know if there aren't structured activities. It's difficult to know who is where. And so if you utilize free time as part of your programming, we want to just think about maybe switching that to free choice. So there are a finite number of choices that your youth can go to that are staffed by staff or volunteers. But somebody has eyes on your participants at all times. Seen many times where this has gone awry, and so we want to make sure that as we return post-COVID, we're thinking about how this has manifested for us in the past and how we can improve this going forward. Lastly, overnight trips and offsite events, these create some challenges for supervision. And so thinking about, if we're going to church camp, how do we supervise if we're on campus somewhere? How do we supervise our participants? How do we empower our staff to know what to do in those situations? And then similarly with offsite events, what do we do with that? If people are spending the night somewhere, how do we manage hotel supervision, et cetera? What are our expectations? Some of these may not fit your lived experience right now. You may not be doing them, and that's okay. But this gives us you have a unique opportunity right now to take a step back and think about how maybe you did these in the past and how you can better do them going forward to reset that expectation this year. One of the other important things to contemplate and think about after we return to programming post-COVID is just knowing the essentials for how to prevent youth-to-youth sexual activity in your ministry. First and foremost, adult supervision is key. It's important to have your staff or volunteers or parent chaperones or whoever you're utilizing for supervision out and about to have a presence so youth know that somebody is there, someone is paying attention to what's going on, and they can't sneak off into remote spaces to get into any sort of trouble or inappropriate behavior. To that end, providing structured activity helps you manage that. If you have free time where kids can roam across the church campus, it's going to be very difficult for you to know who's where, what they're doing, etc. But those structured activities provide you some opportunities to manage that more efficiently. I'll give an example from when I was in youth group. I remember we could be in what we called the pit, was the basement. We could be in the gym, or we could be out in the field. And those were the three activities that we had after our initial worship and Bible study was over. And so that helped limit where people could go, where we could go. And it also ensured that we were supervised in every one of those areas. If you have ratios as part of your programming, you want to make sure that you maintain those. And if you don't have them, you may want to look up what similarly situated programs have as far as ratio to ensure that you're following best practices. Thinking about also your transition time. So if you're transitioning from point A or location A to location B, how do we manage that? Who's keeping eyes on who? How do we know that? How do we make sure that all of our youth got to where they needed to go and didn't sneak off along the way? One important thing to note here is that when it comes to youth-to-youth behaviors, we want to think about referring back to our code of conduct and beefing up the section on what is expected of youth when it comes to public displays of affection. This is an area that I'm sure all of you have had issues with at some point or another in your youth group. But it's important to note that there's no standard definition of what normal sexual curiosity is. There are people who spend their entire careers trying to define what milestones youth should hit when. and they haven't figured it out. So chances are our staff haven't either. So we want to make sure that we are referring back to our code of conduct and having those disciplinary discussions for things that are happening outside of that. We don't want to minimize sexual activity by saying, well, I was making out when I was 13, so I guess that's normal. Because as you know, parents don't send their youth to church in order to be involved in romantic relationships. And so it's important to lean not on your own understanding or your own experience, but to pay attention and empower your staff to contemplate how to respond to this sexual activity if they see it, and to provide them that guidance in your policy. Your staff behavior sets the tone for this. If you are engaging with fellow adult staff members in a healthy and appropriate way, that sets and models for your youth that this is how adults interact. If the interactions are inappropriate or unbecoming of the environment that you're in the church, then this could create problems because, as you know, youth pay attention to what adults do. So your behavior really sets the tone here. So make sure that you are acting above reproach in your role as an employer or volunteer, and share with your staff that that's your expectation for them. Lastly, if you see or are aware of youth-to-youth sexualized behaviors, you want to interrupt them if you see them. Even if you don't see them, but you hear about them, you want to respond to those pursuant to your policy. You want to report them. Sometimes that may require being reported as part of a mandated reporter complaint, depending on the type of sexual activity. And then, of course, you want to document it. But all of those things should be based in your policy, your response, the requirement to interrupt and respond and report, et cetera, so that your staff can lean on that in that emergency situation. Lastly, I just want to share with you some information about our partnership with Insurance Board. We are partners in prevention and here to help you with this work. Insurance Board has worked with us for many years now and provides a variety of services and resources to help you achieve the things that we talked about in the presentation above. For program participants, you can see on the screen there's a section of services and resources that are available to you. And for members, similarly, there's a list of things that are available to you. For more information, or if you'd like to get connected with some of these resources or just have some additional discussions with me, please feel free to connect with us. My information will be found at the end of the presentation, or connect with your Insurance Board broker representative in order to connect with us, get you these resources that you need so that you can tackle this important work of abuse prevention in your church. Thank you for your time today. God bless and have a wonderful day.